World of Warcraft sponsored me to create this Alleria cosplay for the new expansion, The War Within. This video will show you how I used this 3D model to create my entire cosplay. For starters, I went shopping. I collected a bunch of materials for my cosplay storage and also bought a bunch of new ones, such as this nice blonde wig. I also got a bunch of fabrics. I'm thinking this blue navy organza is going to be very useful to create flames for my Alleria bow. I also got 2 pairs of leggings, one black and one dark gray. Because her leggings are two-toned, I'm going to be cutting these up and basically putting them back together again to create a two-toned legging. I can use the excess fabric for other parts in my costume, such as the gloves. Then a few random haberdashery things, such as bias binding, buttons, and more fabric for the dress and the cloak. I'm going to be using this very dark grey fabric dye for synthetic fabrics to dye the tips of my wig. I found these buckles as well, which perfectly match the chest plate in Alleria's costume. I'm going to be using these separated zippers in the leg armor for Alleria. This will make it easy to take them on. Of course, a bunch of silver paints for all her armor and details, and a pantyhose to create a tattoo sleeve for Alleria, so I don't have to paint the tattoos on myself every time. I also dug up these elf ears from Madhouse FX. Some of the crucial fabrics this project are white neoprene, black sky fabric, and silver sky fabric. And of course, for all her armor and her bow prop, I'm going to be using high density EVA foam. I'm mostly using 6mm, and some parts will be made with 10mm or 3mm. I usually plan all my costumes digitally in 3D. This is because I'm very experienced with it, and it gives me a really good overview of all the details up close and personal. I can separate pieces I don't need, and I can see all the details up close. I'm using Papakura, a papercraft app that imports 3D models and creates paper patterns. But instead of paper, I'm using EVA foam, so I'm using a couple different settings that will make it different from actual papercraft. I know how EVA foam works the best and what angles I can use and cut to create this prop. So every sharp angle gets separated as one piece pattern. I'm later using this 3D preview to preview the angles and see where I need to cut any bevels. Once I'm happy with all the pieces, I'm going to start arranging them so I can print them on paper. I only need one side of the pattern, so I'm moving all the pieces I don't need off the paper. I edited the chest armor 3D model to include a few different pieces that you would otherwise not see. Here I use the texture a lot to help me guide. I can print off these pieces on paper with the texture enabled, which will help me add the details later. Printing out my bow prop on paper so I can use them for EVA foam. I'm taping the sheets together, some overlap. When I'm using papercraft patterns, they can often look quite blocky. I'm just deliberately cutting around these blocks and making curves where I need them. Sometimes I use a marker and a preview in the app to check where I need sharp angles or where I can use a curve. Now I can trace all my pattern pieces on my EVA foam. I'm using 6mm high density EVA foam here. I'm saving all my patterns because I need to execute this pattern 4 times. 2 times in reverse. I can just flip over my patterns to the other side to create a reverse. I like using cheap gel pens to draw my patterns. Now I have to cut out all my pieces. Because the papercraft pattern shows me that there's lots of sharp angles in this pattern, I'm mostly using bevel cuts from all pieces. I need a new and fresh knife to do this to make sure that these cuts are nice and clean. I use a table that I can walk around, so I can cut from every angle without having to move everything over. I find this most comfortable. If I have any complex cuts, I try to partition off that section first, so I have a smaller piece to work with and turn around for those tricky areas. After I cut up all my pieces for one side on one end of the bow, I check my Papercraft app for the 3D preview and where every piece needs to go. This makes it a lot easier to assemble, kinda like a really big puzzle. I use barge contact cement in a little bottle to dispense the glue on the sides, and I use popsicle sticks to spread the glue evenly over the edges. It needs to go all the way to the end. Once the glue is dried up, I can glue my pieces together. I start with one end and try to move it down the line. For any tricky curves, I sometimes use the settings from the Papercraft app to create registration marks to line them up, but usually I do without. I've glued up more edges, and after a few minutes of waiting, I can press them together. The bevels I cut create a nice sharp angle and three-dimensional shape. Now I only have to do this 3 more times for the other sides. Once I have 2 sides finished, I glue together one edge so I can still access the inside. I press together the edges that are most important, so just the pointy ends. But I still leave the other side open. I'm going to install a core here later, because the floppy foam is not going to be enough to support the entire prop. Here's one bow arm complete. I just have to glue up the other one. As a core, I'm using an aluminum flat bar. This is convenient because I can shape this one to the shape of the bow, because it's not a very perfect shape. After fitting my foam arms to the aluminum core, I can glue together the other side, locking them in place. The last piece for this bow is the middle part. It's built similarly to the arms, and I have to cut out a bunch of bevels in 45-degree angles with a sharp and fresh knife. I'm also using 6mm high-density EVA foam for this part. Again, I'm checking the Papercraft app for the 3D model preview, so I know exactly where each piece needs to go. I also want this bow to light up, so the next thing I need to do is map out where I need to put my battery and the electronics. I decided to put the battery in the middle because it's the most stable way to house a heavy battery, especially in a lightweight prop like this. And this is how the bow looks like with the middle and arms all assembled. Now it's time to install electronics. Alleria's bow looks like it has some kind of blue flame emitting from it, so I'm going to imitate that using addressable LEDs, also known as neopixels. I'm cutting out a strip along the length of my bow and solder them together. I'm using a little Arduino Nano to control the LEDs, and I'm using the fast LED library to create a blue flame effect. I'm threading the wires all the way to the middle, where they meet in the middle to connect to the battery. The battery is USB, so I'm connecting the wires to an on-off switch and a USB power cable. An Arduino Nano is added to the mix. And voila, we have blue flames. Now it's time to add paint to the prop. I'm using Plastidip to prime the foam. This will help stick the paint later without having to add as many paint coats. I'm using about 2 to 3 layers to create a smooth result. I also spray painted the bow later with a light gray, so it makes it a lot easier to add silver paint to the bow. Here I'm applying silver paint to the bow. The light grey base makes it a lot easier without having to use as many coats of silver paint, because I noticed my silver paint was very translucent. Once I'm done with the silver paint layer, I'm using black and brownish paints to add shadow to the details. To create a fake fire effect, I'm using the blue navy organza to create some kind of flames. I'm using hot glue and fold or organza fabric in a way that looks kind of organic, and I'm covering the LEDs in the process. Final touches on the bow now, using a little bit of ribbon to wrap the handle and using an airbrush to create a little bit of shading around the LEDs. Alleria's bow is complete. I'm especially a fan of the flame effect. It looks super cool and realistic. I'm making the rest of Alleria's armor in a similar way as I did the bow. I'm using the Papercraft app to create patterns for myself, and I'm cutting them out at an angle wherever I need angles. Again, I'm using 6mm high density EVA foam here. This is the shoulder pad for Alleria. Alleria's armor has a lot of bevels. I patterned most of them because they're not all the same size. And creating a 3D bevel is a lot nicer than making a pre-made. After patterning all the bevels, I'm gluing them on the shoulder pad. Again, I'm using the 3D model texture to create more patterns for myself. Her armor has some creases and patterns in it, so I'm using an old soldering iron to create them. This is not the same soldering iron I'm using for my electronics. Also, this stinks a lot, so use a mask when you're doing this. I added the details to the shoulder pad and it's now complete. The same process is repeated for the chest plate. Again, I'm using the Papercraft app to create a pattern and cutting it out in EVA foam. This is also 6mm EVA foam. I'm cutting out bevels where I need sharp angles. I'm saving the patterns to create more details later. Here I'm lining up the patterns with the seam lines from the chest plate. This helps hide seam lines later on, because they're a part of the decoration pattern. To glue large pieces, I join together the ends and then the middle pieces before pressing them together with my thumb to guide the seam line. I find this will keep the seams mostly flat. Because of the flatness of the pattern, I have to curve a little bit into this chest plate using heat gun and some force. Forming the foam like this with heat will make sure that it is permanently shaped. I cut out my details from my previous pattern and taped together wherever I needed them to go. This will help keep the entire build seam free, because I'm relocating the seams to a decoration area, so they're kinda hidden. I'm actually using 10mm EVA foam for this part, because I'm layering the foam on top of the armor. But I want it to be nice and bulky, so it has to be thick foam. Again, I'm using bevel cuts, 45-degree angles, to create a nice 3D shape for my details. These patterns are fairly tricky, so make sure that there is a very sharp and brand new knife. Plus, take your time rotating the foam around. If the piece is too big and intricate, cut out the whole piece first and then cut out smaller details. These cuts were fairly tricky, so I'm cleaning up some areas with my Dremel. Here I'm transferring any details onto the foam pieces before I glue them onto the chest armor. I find it easier to create the details before I glue them on the armor, because you have a much easier work surface. Again, I'm using the soldering iron that I'm not using for electronics to burn details into the EVA foam. Make sure you go slow and that the soldering iron is nice and hot. This will create the best lines. Now I can glue the details to my armor and it's creating a nice 3D effect. Now it's time to move on to some fabric parts. I'm creating some boot covers using fake leather fabric. Again, I used a 3D texture to create this pattern. I have to cut it out 4 times for each side of the boot. I'm also using 3mm high density EVA foam as a backing for the leather. This will keep a nice 3D shape and it doesn't flop around. But at the same time, 3mm EVA foam is thin enough not to look as bulky. I grabbed my separating zippers and fit them to my boot covers. The separating zippers make sure that my boot covers can be on nice and tight and that I can fit them to my shoe very nicely. I'm actually directly sewing the separating zippers to my EVA foam backing with a very wide and large zigzag stitch. The wide stitch will make sure that the foam doesn't tear. Now I'm going to apply some spray glue to attach my sky leather to the boot covers. It's a slightly stretchy sky leather, so it will be able to adjust to these 3D shapes very nicely. Now I'm adding all the other little details to the boot covers, such as foam spikes, lace, grommets, and some edging and color. I'm using small strips of 3mm EVA foam to add some details to these boot covers. I'm gluing them on with super glue. It's the easiest way to add these kind of small details. It's a lot of work for all these tiny details, but the result is very nice. In hindsight, it was probably easier for me to paint these details before I glued them on. But here we are. At least because they're raised, it's slightly easier to get to them without spilling. My boot covers are done. They fit perfectly over my knee-high boots. To create the dress, I usually create a pattern from my own garments. So I'm using a tank top here to get a liberal feeling of how big my pattern needs to be. I measured how long the dress needs to be approximately and then cut out a liberal shape in neoprene white fabric. Then I pinned it on my mannequin. This is actually a 3D printed mannequin based on my own 3D scan that I made in 2019. It's still serving me very well. As you can see, the dress is way too big, but I can cut it off later. For the gloves, I'm using a simple 2-part pattern, sized after my own hands. I'm actually using this part of the legging that I cut off for a previous pattern to create these gloves. It's already nice and stretchy fabric, so it's perfect for the gloves. I used a chalk outline and sew around it. I don't cut out the fingers until I'm satisfied with the size. This way you can adjust it very easily and it's much easier to sew. Turn it inside out and voila, I have a glove. For Alleria's dress, there is a lace parting on the side. I'm not going to be actually lacing it up, so I'm kind of making a fake panel. I'm simply sewing a bunch of black and silver sky leather together. I'm installing a bunch of grommets that I'm going to be using for the lace. Then I lace it up with some silver thread and glue it down. I will never open this parting, so I'm just going to leave it as is. I sewed up 2 extra black sky pieces for the skirt and fitted to my mannequin. Then it's time to attach the dress. I'm going to pin everything down and adjust some pieces and cut off some excess fabric. I'm not going to be worrying about seam allowance because I will be adding foam trim to this dress anyway, so I can glue it straight over the raw edge. Also, it's neoprene fabric, which is very thick, so it's very annoying to hem. I'm attaching the dress to the sky skirt and the lace parting. There's going to be a hidden zipper on the other side, which will make it much easier to pull on the dress. I didn't forget about my armor, I still needed to paint it. So I'm using a light grey in a paint gun to spray all my armor pieces and the bow a light grey. This will make it much easier for me to add on the light silver tint and white paint that I need to use for this armor. After painting everything silver and white, I'm adding a bunch of detail using black and brown paints. This is probably my favorite process, because it really makes the details pop and it makes it look so real. The last part for this costume is figuring out how to attach it. So I'm fitting a bunch of pieces to my mannequin and figuring out which is the best way to attach pieces. I usually use a combination of zippers, Velcro, and magnets. Some small details, such as the cape, still needed to be made. This was also cut from white neoprene fabric and had some foam trim glued to it. I also added a bunch of belts and buckles. Belts actually fold over the buckles. My belts only have one good side, so I'm adding some fake belts to glue over the buckle. Some hot glue gets you very far. This fabric was really tricky to sew, so hot glue worked out much better. I used super glue to add these fake panels to my belts. Again, I have to add foam trim to the dress. This covers up the raw edges and creates the silver edge that I needed for my costume. This was a lot of work, but it was super satisfying to see the result once it was all painted up. Look at that! I think the 3D foam trim really looked really good. Some small details remain, such as the wig. I have to dye the ends black, so I'm using some synthetic fabric dye to dye the ends black. I use a small amount and I dip in and out to create a gradient effect. I styled the wig by cutting a fringe with feather cuts, and I added some volume in the back with a crimping iron to create more volume for the braids. This is a lace front wig, so that means I don't have to create an extra hairline. It already looks seamless. The fringe also needed some black tips, so I'm adding that with a little bit of airbrush paint. One of the last steps that I wanted for my costume was to create a tattoo sleeve. This is really useful because you don't have to add makeup to your costume every day you wear it. And also it doesn't budge or smudge. You can reuse it anytime you want. I'm using some fabric medium and tinted pigments that glow under dark light to create her tattoos. Hopefully it will glow a little bit in black light as well. The tights I'm using here are nude colored and have a high density, which means a high denier. My Alleria costume is done. I'm super proud of it, it looks so badass. I especially like the bow, it looks so cool. I hope this video was useful and you learned some things. This costume had a lot of different techniques that I could try out. Thanks to World of Warcraft for sponsoring me such a badass character. I'm going to be waiting for August 26th and see where Alleria's story takes her in the new World of Warcraft The War Within expansion.